I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. I want to start off by apologizing early in the event there is a lot of traffic noise that I am unable to edit out of the podcast. It's raining while I'm recording, which makes the traffic louder, and apparently even though it is late at night, there is a virtual parade of tractor trailers and vehicles with loud exhaust systems going by my house. I really just should move so that I can record without traffic. Or shut down the street. Anyway, this week we will be traveling to Wales for another UFO incident. I say another UFO incident because we did cover a different one back in episode 42 called the Berwyn Mountain Incident. So today, like in episode 42, I will most likely murder Welsh pronunciations, even though I did look them up and have tried really hard to practice. So forgive me if I mess something up. I really do make an attempt to pronounce things correctly. This incident is the Pentyrch UFO Incident. And I think, honestly, this one is a pretty important case because I believe it is one that really shows that there is, without a doubt, UFO activity going on that governments are covering up. Whether it's secret government experimental craft or aliens or something else, I really can't say. But without a doubt, the information from this particular incident is unnerving, more than others that I have looked into so far. If you've been around a while, you know I am not a fan of aliens and UFOs, that they scare me. I have had my own interactions with seeing UFOs, for lack of a better term, in the sky, far back, even in childhood when I was like 10 years old. So it's not that I don't believe in them. I am skeptical. I think that's because media and government officials have set out to portray people who have experiences as, well, not all their puppies is barking, if you know what I mean. And I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm saying that's how they want them to be portrayed so that they can easily be discounted and the majority of people laugh it off like, oh yeah, they saw an alien, haha, you know. Anyway, this particular case swayed me quite a bit. So I think it is an important one to cover. So let's get into it. Pentyrch is a village located in the western outskirts of Cardiff, the capital city of Wales. People living in Pentyrch are commonly known as Pentyrchians, which I threw in there only because I think it's amusing. It's situated on the side of a mountain called the Garth, which is known locally as the Sleeping Giant. Kaz Clark says the area is like stepping back in time 100 years away from the hustle and bustle of the city. For reference, Pentyrch is about 3.5 hours south of the Berwyn Mountains, which was the location of the other Welsh UFO incident that we covered. As far as resources for this episode, I read the book called The Pentyrch Incident, The Greatest UFO Cover-Up of Modern Times, by Kaz Clark and Gary Jones. I will definitely put a link to the book in the show notes. It was actually a pretty good read. Sometimes books that I get for research end up being kind of a struggle to get through. Not this one. I actually looked forward to reading it. I enjoyed it. So if it's a topic that you have some interest in, definitely check it out. There is more information in the book than I'm going to cover in this episode because I would be here for days. So this incident started on February 23rd, 2016, which means that today is the 8th anniversary of this particular incident, or at least the beginnings of it. But when I say that the incident started on the 23rd, I mean that kind of loosely, because at the time, nobody realized it was starting on that particular day until after the fact. Kaz Clark and several of her neighbors witnessed a small gray twin-propeller plane flying extremely low and slow over the village. The plane was a Shadow R1, not something that really seemed out of the ordinary, because the Royal Air Force, St. Athan, was only 14 miles away, so military aircraft were seen in the area now and then. It's important to note that the Shadow R1 is an intelligence-gathering aircraft. The Royal Air Force website says, the Shadow's high-definition electro-optical and electronic sensors complement other platforms and capabilities, helping analysts prepare comprehensive intelligence products. Satellite communications links enable information to be downloaded and offboarded during a mission, and the aircraft is also fitted with a defensive aid suite. So an intelligence-gathering aircraft is flying at a low altitude over Pentyrch at slow speed. The next day, Wednesday, February 24th, people began making complaints about small aircraft. Some even emailed the Ministry of Defense seeking an explanation. These aircraft, the Shadow R1s, were circling the Pentyrch skies. And, in case you're wondering, the Ministry of Defense did not offer any reply or explanation. Even the local news ignored inquiries about the unusual activity. There were no exercises listed on the Ministry of Defense website. Later that afternoon, the Shadow R1 was replaced by a Britten-Norman Defender. The Defender was developed for roles such as utility transport, casualty evacuation, counterinsurgency and light attack, forward air control, patrol, and reconnaissance. It had the same flight pattern of low and slow. The plane was low enough that the pilot was able to notice people watching him, and when he did, it veered off towards Pentyrch. Though locals couldn't see it, they could still hear it. And it eventually returned to the same flight pattern, and continued throughout the night into the next morning. No one was even acknowledging that the planes existed, and this kind of continuous flight had never happened before. Kaz Clark said she began to think it was a real situation, though she wasn't sure what exactly was going on. It continued into Thursday, February 25th. For 3 days and nights, the two aircraft took turns flying the continuous pattern over Pentyrch. The airspace was never left unwatched in that time. Locals knew the planes were watching for something, but they weren't sure what. It was speculated that it was perhaps Russian planes they were waiting for. I know that might sound rather far-fetched, but there actually were 2 Russian bombers that were turned away from the UK airspace on February 18, 2016, so just a few days before this all started. At this point, Kaz and 2 of her neighbors, David and Donna, decided to try and find out what the planes were looking for. If the planes were still in the airspace later that night, they were going to watch to see what was going on. As the day headed into the night, the flight patterns of the planes seemed to intensify, flying over Kaz's house every 7 to 10 minutes, though never going completely out of sight. At 7 p.m., Kaz's neighbor David arrived. They checked the radar using an online flight radar website, and they saw the airspace was empty. All civilian aircraft were avoiding Welsh airspace. Only military aircraft were there, though they were not showing on the radar screen. That's not really unusual. In case you're wondering, military aircraft sometimes are unidentifiable on radar. So Kaz lights up her fire pit in her garden, and she and David watch the plane circle the area. They were able to see at least 5 other planes in the distance, flying single file in a large circle around the area. They were too far away to identify, and were also not showing on the radar, but they were large aircraft. Around 10 p.m., Donna joined the party. She ended up going inside the house because even with the fire, it was pretty chilly out. She would end up making hot drinks and bring them out to Kaz and David, then return inside, but her fear of the situation kept her inside most of the night. The night continued into the early morning hours of Friday, February 26th. Kaz and David were still outside by the fire, watching, and Donna had gone in the house to stay. At 2 a.m., Kaz tells David she's going to call it a night because nothing had changed and it was cold and late. As she was about to enter her house, she heard what she described as the sound of a missile approaching and ran back to the fire pit to see a huge plane flying past at about 2,000 feet. The plane had a mushroom-shaped object on the back of it. David identified it as an E-3 Sentry plane. Per the Air Force website, the E-3 Sentry is an Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS, aircraft with an integrated command and control battle management, surveillance, target detection, and tracking platform. The aircraft provides an accurate, real-time picture of the battle space to the Joint Air Operations Center. AWACS provides situational awareness of friendly, neutral, and hostile activity, command and control of an area of responsibility, battle management of theater forces, all altitude and all weather surveillance of the battle space, and early warning of enemy actions during joint, allied, and coalition operations. The E-3 circled 7 times, and as it began to circle again, Kaz spotted a single bright red light high above the fields behind them. Kaz and David ran to the farmland behind her house for a better look. They stood at the gate to the field and watched the one red light turn into 3 in a triangle formation. Then more red lights emerged. On the right-hand edge, 6 more red lights with smaller red lights in between became visible. More lights on the left appeared. The lights formed a pyramid coming in point first and seemed to appear through space like it was coming out of a portal. It turned slowly counterclockwise and swung down until it righted itself. There were bright red lights all around its perimeter, and in between were smaller, dimmer red lights. This was all happening only about 200 yards away from where they were watching. The object hovered silently above the tree line that ran along the border of the field. All of a sudden, the pyramid-shaped object fired an extremely bright green object out of its top. It was fired exceptionally fast. The green object moved to the left above a smaller thicket and stopped. It was only a couple of 100 feet up and approximately 100 feet away from where Kaz and David stood. It stayed there, swaying side to side, and looked to be surveying the area. They couldn't describe the shape because it was too bright and hurt their eyes when they looked at it. The E-3 Sentry plane was still flying in an oval flight pattern. The pyramid object started to move slowly backwards, still turning counterclockwise, and tilted slightly to the right. It appeared that the craft was landing, but it wasn't actually landing. The slope of the land was rising up in that area. Just as it was about to hit land, the craft sent out a fire-colored hand of lightning as though it was preventing itself from hitting the ground. It wasn't thin like typical lightning, but thicker. The whole ship lit up brightly. The corner lights changed color from the red to bright white orange. The lights closest to the ground were the brightest, so bright that they illuminated part of the object and showed that it was a solid craft. The red lights on the right-hand side of the pyramid were still brighter than the other red lights and looking like perhaps they were steering the craft. It slowly moved backwards away from where Kaz and David were watching. David was fascinated. Staring at the top of the pyramid, he said there were 15 or 20 orbs that came out at the top that were mingling with each other and were red and green. Kaz did not see them because she was fixated on the object hitting the ground. David's statement is as follows. It just paused for a second, planes still circling overhead, then about 15 to 20 red orbs all came from it as if they were floating around it, protecting it, intermingling with each other. Some started to turn green, whilst others stayed red. The large craft started to slowly move west without gaining any height. As it drifted away slowly, it turned to darkness and the lights went off. The orbs remained. Some also went to darkness and invisible to the naked eye. The bright green object was still above the trees to the left, still gently swaying side to side. Then they heard the military planes coming in from overhead, very loud. Kaz looked up for a moment and saw 2 C-17s flying wingtip to wingtip, and when she looked back, she couldn't see the pyramid anymore. It was unclear if the object was gone or if it had simply turned off the lights. 2 more planes flew in. These were Hercules C-130, coming in from the left, turning and ending up behind the C-17s, taking up the outside wide positions. The 4 planes took up the entire width of the visible airspace and headed directly towards where the pyramid was last seen. The green object moved in a straight line very fast over and in front of the 4 planes, flashing 3 extremely bright green strobes at them. The object moved westward towards Pentyrch, bouncing. Kaz felt it could have easily outrun the planes if it chose to. It seemed to be deliberately drawing the military planes away from the main pyramid craft, like a decoy. All 4 military planes were bathed in the green light, and Kaz could see the details of the planes. The E-3 Sentry was still flying west to east in an oval pattern. Then 2 red barrel-shaped objects appeared on the right and were about the size of a smart car. There was no noise, no downdraft from the barrel objects. One of the barrels stopped above the hedge to the left, about 30 feet away and 20 feet above the ground. It had no details or markings. They were capped on the top and bottom with something black. The sides seemed smooth as though made from glass. The insides were moving, like white noise on a TV. The second barrel was right above them. Kaz waved at the object, hoping that was a universal sign of hello and we're harmless. The object stopped and changed color to green, and Kaz felt the tension leave her body. She said it felt like a giant hand had reached in and taken my fear away. I felt elated, like I had been touched by something almost euphoric. The other barrel object, still red, started to move away, low, across the fields to the left, and the green one moved off to the right above the houses. At this point, David wanted to go to the field where the pyramid had discharged smaller crafts. He wanted to see if there were any more barrel objects. The E-3 Sentry plane followed. They walked to the next gate but didn't see anything. It was pitch black, and neither had a flashlight, so they went back to where they had observed everything. They could hear helicopters off in the distance. They saw 3 Apache helicopters in pyramid formation, 1 above, 2 below, and very low across the fields. They were moving from left to right, headed on a direct course to intercept the first green object that had led the planes away. The helicopters flew off out of sight, but the E-3 Sentry was still there. Kaz and David walked back to the house, followed by the E-3 Sentry. David and Donna, who had been asleep on the couch the whole time, went home. Kaz had trouble sleeping, being too energized by what she had witnessed. And as she was attempting to sleep, there was a loud boom from the direction of Pentyrch, to the west, about 5 miles. She felt in her heart that they had shot down the green object. And before you start thinking that boom was nothing more than a dream Kaz had while drifting in and out of sleep, that explosion was so huge that it registered on the Richter scale, 40 miles away in Monmouth, at exactly 4:21 a.m. Though back in his home, David was also unable to sleep and could see the Royal Air Force St. Athan. He watched 3 Apache helicopters and 3 Chinook helicopters flying to and from the base out of Lantricent and back. He also heard the explosion. After the explosion, he could only see 2 Apaches. At 4:34 a.m., the missing Apache was forced to do an emergency landing at Cardiff International Airport, with smoke coming from its cockpit. Later that morning, BBC Wales released a story that military training planes kept areas of South Wales awake. Residents of Lantricent reported 2 explosions. The first was a huge air explosion, and the second sounded like something had hit the ground. Eyewitness accounts were posted in another local paper. They read, "There were 3 helicopters flying very low for hours. I phoned 101. I was worried that something horrible had happened." Another said she was awoken by an explosion in the middle of the night. There were helicopters and planes everywhere, and then something hit and made an explosion. There were also hundreds of one-line comments about the explosion in military aircraft. Around 10 a.m., Kaz, Donna, and David, and another friend named Steve, went to the field expecting to see burn marks, but there were none. But all the bushes in the area where the hand of lightning had touched the ground had all the life sucked from them, and they appeared dead. The grass was brown and limp. One area of the field seemed to be hot compared to the surrounding area, and in that one field it was snowing. The snow had an unusual texture, small, a little like hail, but soft and spongy like a beanbag ball. Donna had been walking the field searching the ground and called out to the group. At first they thought she had found something, but she needed help. She told them she felt like she was being watched and she could not move, frozen in fear, and wanted to leave. So they headed back to the house. Donna was terrified and went home. Kaz, David, and Steve decided to head to Lantricent. There they asked a local couple out walking their dog if there had been anything unusual. The couple said they had seen a Chinook helicopter landing and military troops got out while other helicopters with searchlights circled the area. A huge explosion had come from the sky and a second explosion had come from Smilog Woods. Smilog Woods, also known as Lantricent Forest, is described as a fantastic woodland, ancient in parts, good for dog walking, cycling, and watching the wildlife. There is a car park at the center of the woodland, but no facilities. Great for ramblers and walkers. It's a large wooded hill that rises above the Royal Glamorgan Hospital. Off they headed into the woods and parked in the small parking area. The woods were dark as very little sunlight penetrated through the canopy. They began looking for damage, hoping to find an impact crater. They eventually came across some fresh branches laying on the ground that had come from the canopy. It started with just a few small branches, but the deeper they went, the larger the branches became. There were huge branches lying to the left and right in a straight line, and the canopies of the trees were missing. They followed the trail up a steep climb through the woods that was laid out in a perfectly straight line. They came out of the woods onto a forestry road and could see the path of damaged trees. They made their way back to the car and headed back to Kaz's house. There they made plans to head out to Smilog Woods the next day with cameras. Saturday, February 27th, 9 a.m., the group of 4, Kaz, Steve, Donna, and David, headed to Smilog Woods. They began their search where they had left off the day before at the forestry road. The debris trail was clear. Huge trees had exploded, and the remaining trunks were distended, as though something caused some kind of expansion in the tree. Branches from the canopy were snapped off and thrown around the forest floor. They continued to hike through the woods and emerged onto another small forestry road. Across the road from where they were standing, there were 60-foot trees that had been snapped off mid-trunk, about 20 feet in the air. Debris from the trees was everywhere, as though the trees had exploded. Once again, there was a strange snow falling in just that area, though the sky was blue. All the trees in the impact area were scuffed and burned, and there was a strong sulfur smell in the air. Some trees had large injuries where bark had been stripped off. It looked like something heavy had been dragged upwards, beginning about 20 feet off the ground. Other trees had strange burn marks, but the burns weren't black. They were white and surrounded by some sort of chemical burn. Trees with trunks 12 inches thick were snapped like twigs, 6 trees in total. They believed the green object never hit the ground, but instead had come to rest or was wedged in the trees 20 feet in the air. Looking back at the debris field, it was obvious that whatever came through did so at a high rate of speed and at an angle as it descended. There was no other damage outside that debris field, and the group searched a larger area looking. Heavy snow was present at the impact site, though no snow was in the forecast, and the weather conditions were not conducive for snow. One other thing that they noticed were unusual tire tracks in the mud along the road. The tracks were from a heavy vehicle, and it was later determined that they were Tyrone run-flat tires, specifically used on military vehicles. And the internet radar showed that the military was circling again, only now they were circling Lantricent, concentrating on Smilug Woods. Kaz began to reach out to ufologists, seeking answers, and ended up addressing people at a seminar, and others in the audience shared their own experience from that night. One woman said it took her 3 hours to get home the night everything happened, because every road she tried to use was closed by police. Each time she was turned around, they said a lorry had overturned. That's a truck for non-UK people. Another person who was a nurse at the Royal Glamorgan Hospital, and you'll remember that was the hospital on the edge of Smilug Woods, had heard and felt the explosion. It shook the entire hospital. Smoke from the explosion came into the hospital hallways through vents and windows. Outside, the smoke was so dense that it looked like fog. The beginning of March, Kaz and Steve met an investigator out at Smilug Woods to look at debris. There was still debris, but a lot had been moved and piled up into huge piles. In the aftermath of the event, a group of people camped out in the fields of Pentyrch. They had large tents, porta-potties, and smaller sleeping tents. There were soldiers there who were armed. When asked why they were concealing their weapons, they responded with, "We don't want to upset the locals." Kaz took a walk through the fields to see what was going on, and she learned that the people there were supposedly from Vodafone doing research, but that was different than what the soldiers said who claimed it was a military exercise. This is an excerpt from the book. There was a man who saw them and came over to see what they were doing. Kaz asked if he was there because of the UFO. He said, "We don't know anything about that," but he didn't ask anything about it either, and I thought that was odd. Human curiosity dictates you would at least ask something. He told us he was security for the camp and a close protection officer. For the benefit of my friends who had not been around earlier in the day, I asked what they were doing wearing forensic suits in the field. He told us they were looking for mock mines. I laughed and asked, "Do you often send civilians to look for mines wearing paper suits? It's a sure way to find them." We all laughed. It was not long before the rest of the campers returned, and he opened the gate to let them back in. They trundled through in their jeeps and vans, and he, along with the other members, returned to the campsite. A few minutes later, he came back to us and asked if we would be there for long. I said, "We will be here for as long as the sky is clear." "My commanding officer is not going to like that," he replied. I looked at Steve and laughed and said, "I didn't know Vodafone had a commanding officer." He went on to say, "He's going to want to speak with you." "Fine," I said. "Go and get him." So, a few minutes later, a rather angry, stocky man stormed toward us with some intent, his security man scurrying behind, trying to keep up. "You're trespassing," he shouted. "Have you got permission to be here?" "I don't need permission to be here. That is a public footpath," I replied. "No, that's a public footpath," he shouted, ever more animated, whilst pointing to it. I laughed and said, "Are you joking? That's 12 feet away. The only thing the country code desires me to do is to take my rubbish home." The commanding officer became enraged and asked me for identification. This just about tipped me over the edge. Having PTSD and not knowing it at the time, my emotions were quite erratic, and I would go from 0 to 100 in a split second. I instantly retaliated and shouted back in his face, "We fought 2 world wars so we would have the right to be free, and as long as we are not breaking the law or hurting anyone, we have a goddamn right to be here. I remember the fascist war movies. Show me your papers. Well, I don't have to show you anything." I really love Kaz Clark. I want to be Kaz Clark when I grow up. So the following morning, after this all happened, the camp was gone. And in case you're wondering, Vodafone is a technology communications company in Europe and Africa, and it's based in Britain. Gary Jones, the co-author of the book, began investigating this incident in 2017. Other accounts of the incident were shared with him. It was Thursday night into Friday morning, and things heated up. Wednesday afternoon, I noticed an AWACS radar tracking plane circling our area while I was cleaning the car. But by 1 a.m. early Thursday morning, started to get a bit worried as to what was really happening. Anyways, fell asleep, and guess what? He was still there the next morning, and all day and into the night. I was taking the dog for a quick walk before bed just after midnight Thursday, along a road I can't pronounce, while watching the plane in the sky, and from nowhere another plane appeared and joined the circle, followed by 2 more and then another. There were now 5 large planes all in the same circle, so I watched because I thought that it was strange. With that, a bright red pulsing light, then another and another, which formed the shape of a triangle, came down from the clouds, in the middle of the circle. As it got lower, it lit up with more pulsing red lights. It had come down very low and looked very large indeed. I don't think it touched down totally, but about 10 to 12 feet from the ground, and lit up fully, showing the full outline of it. Then it dimmed down to black, and then red and green orbs came from it, as if they were dancing and molding into one, pulsing from red to green. Slowly, a green orb shot up in the middle of the aircraft and started pulsing very fast and bright, then slowly headed northwest, just bobbing along, glowing. 2 of the aircraft had come out of the formation and followed it. Others remained glowing, red and dimming. Where the large craft came down by this time, I had seen enough and didn't know who was more scared, me or the dog. I hurried on home, thinking I had seen something I shouldn't have. I couldn't sleep for hours after, and I think it was about 4 a.m. that there was an almighty explosion in the distance, followed by a second about 3/4 of a second later. Whatever was going on, the Ministry of Defense were very involved. I've told you everything I know as I saw it. Please don't contact me, as it was something I would rather forget. Seeing as being military involved, I don't want to be in any bother with Ministry of Defense, thanks. Hope you get to the bottom of this, but we'll say one thing. They knew that was coming. There were FOIA requests that were made by ufologists, and this was the reply. Thank you for your email of the 18th of March 2016 requesting the following information. Can the MOD state why would such an exercise involving live ammunition be conducted next to a hospital in the early hours of the morning, last over 9 hours? Can the MOD state what the purpose of the exercise was? Can the MOD state whether similar exercises are planned in the future? If so, when and where? Why did the MOD not choose to use a military-owned piece of land, such as the training land at the nearby Sennybridge area, for such a loud and disturbing operation? What activity took place on the ground when the military were seen landing vehicles in the vicinity? What targets were fired at during the operation? What was the cause of the 2 explosions that were heard by residents? Why did the M4 need to be closed? If there was a danger to cars on the M4, was there also potential danger to residents in the nearby hospital, which was not closed? A search for the information has now been completed within the Ministry of Defense, and I can confirm that information and scope of your request is held. The information you have requested can be found at Annex A. However, some of the information falls entirely within the scope of the qualified exemptions provided for at Section 26 of the FOIA and has been withheld. Section 26(1)(b) has been applied to some of the information because it would reveal considerable detail about the defense's exercise program and capabilities, which would increase the security risk around planned exercises and provide tactical advantage to our enemies. The balance of public interest was found to be against releasing the information, as doing so would prejudice the capability, effectiveness, or security of our armed forces. For these reasons, I have set the level of prejudice against release of the exempted information at the higher level of would rather than would be likely to. Yours sincerely, Joint Forces Command, HQ Secretariat. Can the MOD state why would such an exercise involving live ammunition be conducted next to a hospital in the early hours of the morning and last over 9 hours? The answer: no live ammunition was used. Exercising troops were issued with blank, simulated ammunition, which mimics the sound of firing without any projectile exiting the weapons. Can the MOD state what the purpose of the exercise was? The answer: the exercise is one of a number carried out on a regular basis by our armed forces as part of their ongoing commitment to the defense of the UK. Why did the MOD not choose to use a military-owned piece of land? Answer: whilst MOD training areas are most often used for training, they do not always contain the features required for certain activities. In these cases, alternative locations are sought and used with the agreement of the landowner. They would not answer what activity took place on the ground. What targets were fired at during the operation? Answer: no live ammunition was used, therefore no targets were fired on. What was the cause of the 2 explosions that were heard by residents? Answer: the explosions were controlled detonations of simulated munitions to assist the exercise. Why did the M4 need to be closed? Answer: no information is held by the MOD. Decisions on road closures are made by the local authority, in this case South Wales Police, so not very helpful. Investigations of the field showed that the EMF trail and the measurements were higher than a microwave. The investigative team suffered nausea, dizziness, headaches, and a burning, itching skin sensation. Photos taken in the field did not turn out. At the crash site in the woods, an EMF trail followed the debris path. Everything inside the crash site was dead, and all the trees the green object had gone through that created the debris field were gone. When it was asked why the trees were removed, the response from the Natural Resources Wales was that larch disease had infected larch trees and they required removal. This particular tree disease has a very strict procedure for how to handle infected trees. A sanitized felling happens first, where every stump, branch, and twig is removed, and those doing the removal must wear overalls and footwear, and machinery must be sanitized. Only licensed people can carry this out. The land itself must be left fallow for at least 3 years. In an area that actually had been affected by larch disease, a forest was turned into a field, and warning signs and closed areas were erected. In Smilog Woods, there were no warning signs and no closed areas. The areas where the trees were removed were also immediately replanted. So a FOIA request was sent to Natural Resources to ask why there was no sanitized felling and why the area was replanted. The response was that even though there is a time constraint for planting, it didn't apply to them. Natural Resources Wales keeps notices that have been placed in pertaining to larch disease. Though they claimed there was a notice placed at Smilog Woods, there has never been a health notice placed in Smilog Woods for larch disease, according to Natural Resources Wales' own records. It was discovered during the investigation that on the night of February 25th into the 26th, all the roads in Smilog Woods had been closed by the military. When they asked about the military having permission to close roads in Smilog Woods, the response was, there was no permission granted to the military to close the woodland and public paths and let off explosives in the woodlands mentioned during these dates, or in fact any dates, so we have no records. This type of activity would have required permission, so if it had occurred, we would have had a record. Witnesses in the hospital heard gunfire and explosions, and helicopters circled for hours. So what was going on? A large section of the M4 motorway was also closed, and the CCTV cameras on that stretch were shut off. Then a new witness came forward who lived southwest of Pentyrch. The witness stated that he saw a huge craft with lights, and also that he even saw some of the smaller objects fly over his house. He witnessed the green objects that were apparently hiding from the helicopters in the field next to his house. There were 3 helicopters flying from side to side in a sweeping motion. None had identifying lights and appeared to travel across the field towards the green lights. The green light popped up and skipped away as a helicopter approached. The helicopters pursued it northwest toward Lantrisson. As the large craft moved over his house, he could see a green hue. His dog went nuts, and his house was full of static electricity. So what the heck was going on in Pentyrch in 2016? As I mentioned at the beginning, this incident has opened my eyes more than others to the fact that something is definitely going on, and governments know and are definitely hiding the information. I do encourage you to read the book. There is a lot more information there pertaining to the investigation into the incident and their findings so far. It is rather frightening and mind-blowing. That's going to do it for this episode. As always, you can find Lurk wherever you listen to your other favorite podcasts. You can also find episodes at lurkpodcast.com, along with links to our social media. If you have any topic suggestions, send them my way. Drop me a line at lurkpodcast@yahoo.com. And until next time, keep lurking.